Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the All Things Admin Admin Tech Crash Course. My name is Julie Perrine. I'm the founder and CEO of All Things Admin, and I'm very pleased you're joining us for today's presentation. The Admin Tech Crash Course is a technology-focused training program for busy professionals, and our goal with each session is to create a crash course on the relevant technology topics that you need to stay current on the technology and software you use each day so you can be more productive and proficient in everything you do. And today's topic, Excel PivotTables Made Easy, being presented by one of our favorite award-winning certified technology instructors, Donna Gilliland. Donna is the president of mosttraining.com, and if you haven't met Donna yet, you are in for a real treat today. Donna's career began in technology back when DOS was the king of computer operating systems for the personal computer. Floppies were actually still floppy, and the internet had just begun to explode. At that time in her career, there were no training companies. You either learned it on your own or went back to school to learn all about these new technologies, and Donna did both. Her career in the corporate world started as an executive assistant. She worked in a programming department supporting a staff of programmers and the VP of IT. And over time, she realized that she had an aptitude for learning software technologies and the ability to communicate with others in terms that all could understand. And her love of helping people, business, and technology made a fantastic fit for her future career in training. So please join me in a warm virtual welcome for Donna Gilliland. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you, Julie. Always. I'm glad to be here. So we're going to dive right into pivot tables, and in just a moment an explanation of that. But I always like to let people know that if you're studying for your Microsoft Office certification, pivot tables is one of the objectives on that exam. And of course, with the exam, if you've never taken one, it is timed and it is interactive inside the program, and you have only a certain amount of time to complete your task. So I'm glad that if you are studying for your certification that you're getting to attend today's webinar on pivot tables. And if your world is Excel every day and you're having to run reports and extract specific sets of data to analyze, then I'm really glad that you're able to be here today. And if you have not used pivot tables before, you should be able to do that easily by the time that we complete today. If you have created pivot tables before, hopefully this will be a nice review and maybe you'll pick up a few new things that you didn't have before. So I have a spreadsheet on the screen that I'm going to be working with, and it would be helpful if you first knew what the content of the spreadsheet's about, because understanding what you're working with any pivot table to create any pivot table is important. So this practice file is a list of employees, and they're tracking, this is a campaign where they are doing, they're selling flights. So they're keeping track of the salespeople, the office that they work out of, and where they're selling flights to, and the amount of that ticket, how many tickets they sold, and what the grand total turned out to be for each employee's sale, and then whether or not the employee for that particular sale received a commission. So with a pivot table report, I could quickly learn strategic pieces of information about what we're reporting. Something very simple is I may want to see a list of all the offices that are within my organization, and then within those offices, how much money did we make in this campaign? So that's only 2 fields. So that's just to set you up with a clarity as to what this data is we're working on. So let me back up a little bit and get you started with some things that are required before you ever create a pivot table. It is important how your spreadsheet data is laid out. I'm sure you've seen spreadsheets before, and maybe you have some like this as well, where people will use different techniques for how they lay out their spreadsheet, sometimes more from a visual appealing way, and they might have some row breaks, some column breaks as they designed their spreadsheet. Well, that is problematic in using a pivot table or in using a number of features in Microsoft Excel, including filters. So if you are tasked with creating a spreadsheet, you want to think about these rules because it will help you in terms of the usability of your spreadsheet later and being able to effectively use features in Microsoft Excel like the one you're coming here to learn today. So these basic things apply, and that is that every single column in your spreadsheet, just like this one has, make this a little larger for us, just like this spreadsheet has, each column has a field heading, and each one would need to be unique. So that's number one requirement. The second requirement is that you don't want any column breaks and you don't want any row breaks, because with each break, Excel will see that as a different data set. So you need to make certain that your structure is very simplistic, just like this one is. So those are rules to keep in mind. Now, in order to create the pivot table, the first thing is to be somewhere within the pivot. You don't want to be in an outside range. For example, I've gone over here to column J. There's nothing there, and at this point, I'm outside of the data range, and I won't be able to create the pivot table outside that range. So just click somewhere in your range, and then the step to begin the process begins from the Insert ribbon. And when you click the Insert ribbon, your very first set of tools are Table tools, and you have an option for Pivot Table, an option for Recommended Pivot Tables, and then one for a table. Now, if you're using a lower version of Microsoft Excel, perhaps you're working with 2010, where I'm working with 2013, you don't have the option that says Recommended Pivot Tables. So let me go ahead and explain what that is in the event that you do have this version. Just like the prompt says, is this option would recommend pivot tables that summarize your particular data set that you're in. So you can use that to have the program give you a recommendation for how to create a pivot table with the data set that you have. Now for us today, we're going to stick with creating our own by being very specific about what we want to pull and what we don't want to pull. So to begin the process, from the Insert ribbon, click the button that says Pivot Table. Now when you do that, when you look closely at my screen, besides the dialog box that you're seeing, when you look in the back area there, you can see that there is a border running around the entire area of the spreadsheet, because as long as it doesn't detect any breaks, it's grabbing everything. So let's go and focus on the dialog box. The dialog box has preset certain things. For example, the select a table or range. It has already selected a range based upon the data set that I was active in at the time I asked for a table. You have a second radio button that says use an external data source. While it's not relative to us today, it might be relative to you later. Some organizations do tie their spreadsheets back to databases so that they can use external data sources to bring data into their spreadsheet, and then that employee can use that more familiar tool, Excel, to analyze data that's coming from another source, perhaps a database. The second one says choose where you want the pivot table report to be placed. The default is assuming that we would like it in a new worksheet. As a general rule, I encourage it to be in a separate worksheet. This would occur, of course, in the same workbook, because when you're working with a pivot table, you have the ability to collapse and expand information, and that may get in the way of your data where it's positioned in the original sheet. So that's my preference, is I prefer to work with it in a separate sheet. And now I'm just ready to give it the OK, because I am going with all the defaults. Now as soon as you click OK, you are placed in another sheet, but it is in the same workbook. And the very first thing as a new user of pivot tables is for you to have a clear understanding of everything that's on this screen, besides the obvious where it is a spreadsheet layout. So what we're going to do is start from the top and then work down from there. When you look at the top of the screen, you have a ribbon that is unique to working with a pivot table, because it is what would be termed as a contextual ribbon. For example, if I click anywhere in this sheet right now where I've come outside the pivot table grid, which is parked here on the left, and you look back at my ribbon tab options, there is no more option for the pivot table because I'm out of context of that. Now I'll click back in the grid on the left, and here we go again, pivot table tools, and there are two ribbons. Both of them you and I will work with today. So that's one of the primary things to focus on, is that you have a ribbon, two of them, that have tools for working with your pivot table. Now the second piece is we're going to work from left to right. The left-hand side, this grid that you see here, as you pick fields of information to place in your report, then this grid will change to have the information that you choose to place within. Now let's look to the far right of the screen, and the far right is a list of those fields. They call them pivot table fields, but these fields are the fields that are back in the spreadsheet that you started creating from. In our case, we're creating from a spreadsheet called promotion sales, and these are all the fields that are back in the master spreadsheet we're working off of. And when you want to include data from those fields into your pivot report, which we're about to do, it's a simple matter of clicking the field square that you want. But you need to know some little nuances about choosing, say, a text field versus a numeric field in your list of fields. And before I do that, be aware of the bottom half of the screen. There are four quadrants, one for filters, which we'll talk about shortly, one for columns, one for rows, and one for values. So let's get started selecting so that you can see. I know I want to see a list of all the offices within the company that have participated in this campaign of selling flights. Well, when you click a text field, which I'm about to do, office, the assumption is that you want the data coming from that field to be placed row-wise. But if you look down at the bottom in these four quadrants, you can see here it says rows, and there's office. And here are my list of offices on the left-hand side of the screen. So here are my list of offices. Now, had I wanted the data from the office field to be placed as a column, then I could just click, drag, and drop it to the columns quadrant, and that would be placed as a column. Other things to keep in mind about the numeric field, like at this moment, I want to know something very simple. I wanted to see a list of the offices in the campaign. I've got that. I want to know how much money we made so far with this campaign. And that information, the money, is coming from the total field. Well, it is a numeric field. When you click a numeric field, it will automatically sum up the numbers and then place them into your pivot. And as you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you can see we've got our first pivot table, a list of the offices and broken down by how much money we've made by office according to what's been tracked so far in that workbook. And if you'll look back over to the pivot table pane on the right and you look down in the values quadrant, you can see it says sum of total. And you will be learning today that you can change the value, the calculation rather, that is automatic. As you can see, the automatic calculation is to sum, but we can change those very easily, and you will learn how to do that today. But I always tell people, if you can click and you can drag, you can pretty much create a pivot table. It's a matter of, in a large part, of just knowing what is it that you want to analyze, what is it you want in the report. And what I love of many things about the pivot table, say over a filter, so if you've ever used filters in Microsoft Excel, you know that with a filter, you are choosing what you want to see based upon a field, but yet all the other fields remain in place. You know, they're not suppressed from sight. But with a pivot table, we get to pick exactly the fields that we want to appear on the screen in our report, which is great. So far we've gone over the very basics of you adding fields, but what if you wanted to rearrange the fields? For example, I'm going to add another field. I'm going to add the destination field, which shows where these flights have been going to. Now, two things for you to keep in mind. When you choose a text field, the first one you select becomes the outermost row of your pivot. And as you look back at my pivot, these are the list of offices. But see, now I'm going to select where they've been selling flights to. And because I choose it second, I'm clicking now Destination. The assumption is you want it to be as a row, and it will place it as a row, but because it was chosen second, it is indented up under the first selection, which is Office. So the hierarchical structure that builds in the pivot, the order in which it builds is dependent upon the order that you make your selection. And as you can see on my screen on the left, here are my offices, and now broken down within the offices is where they sold flights to, and then how much money they made selling flights to these specific locations. Now that gets us into what if now you decided that you want the destination to be the outermost row and the office to be the inner row. It's very easy. You can just click and drag to make that change. So I'm coming here in the pivot table pane down to the row quadrant where it shows me office, destination buttons. Well, placing your mouse pointer on office in the rows pane, you'll have a four-headed arrow, and click, hold, drag beneath. You'll see a horizontal line appear, and once it's beneath the field in question, in my case destination, and let go, it has switched it out. Now looking back at my screen in the pivot, now what you're seeing as headings are the flight destinations. Here's the flight that went to Boston. This is the grand total of money we made selling flights to Boston, and all of these are the offices that were involved in selling flights where Boston was the destination. So it's easy to get fields in, and it's easy to rearrange those fields. You're just a click and a drag away from rearranging them. But then I spoke a moment ago about your calculation. It always assumes you want to add up all your numbers. And for example, when you look inside the pivot on my screen on the left, there it is, a button, which is really called a field button. And it's telling you that this field is total that comes from your spreadsheet. But for this field, it's performing a sum. So you're always told what it is, even in the pivot. And by the way, these generic labels that the program provides are all changeable. You'll just click within and type over with a more meaningful name that represents the data being presented at the time. So now let's go forward with the how do you change the calculation. There are at least 3 different ways for you to change the calculation of a calculated field. One way is to click on the field button itself. In my case, I'm clicking on sum of total, so I'm on that field button. And again, we want to go back to your ribbon. Your ribbon, Pivot Table Tools, at the top has Analyze and it has Design. Analyze is the one we want. If you're using a lower version of Excel, perhaps 2010 as mentioned before, I believe your tab will say Options. So it says Analyze, and looking to the far left of this ribbon, you have a set of tools that says Active Field. And looking closely, it tells you that the active field, the one that I am sitting on, sum of total, it tells me that that is my active field, sum of total. And then there is a button beneath for field settings. And when clicked, a dialog box appears showing that it is doing a sum. And then there are other calculations that you can choose from, such as counting up the number of entries, performing an average, getting the highest number reported, which is the max function, where the min function is give me the lowest number reported. So there's a lot of different functions here that you can choose from. Now I'm going to choose average to change the calculation, and then be aware of this while I'm in this dialog box. You can see that my numbers in the pivot table, they're not formatted, but you can change that by using the number format in this dialog box and choose number format, and then it launches probably a very familiar box for you if you're an Excel user. You've been in this number box before, no doubt. And I'm on the general category, and I want a number category, and number category of course always defaults to 2 decimal placements, whether we're working in a pivot or something else. And I'll leave it at 2 decimal placements. I do have number, and click on OK. And I click OK again and see my numbers have changed. And my field button does say that this field is now being calculated on with an average rather than a sum. Now here's another way for you to change the field setting. One way is come back over to the pivot table pane on the right. And on the right, in the fourth block on the right, it says values. And it tells you it is performing an average. So here I am on the far lower right, and there's a down arrow there. And when you click the down arrow, a menu arrives, and there's that option again, value field settings. Just another place, do the same thing. So choosing value field settings brings up the same box, and then it's a matter of you selecting the one you want, and then follow with OK. A final way, if you're like me, I right-click everything because it's quicker to me. And if you feel the same, you can right-click that field called sum of total or whatever your calculation, whatever your field name is. Then you can choose value field settings. 3 different ways. So now I'm going to change this back. Let's see, yes, I already have it at sum of total. And then of course I could certainly change change it to a currency. I can do all the formatting you typically do in any spreadsheet. So that would be a way for you to change from the default calculation of a sum. And we're going to get a little bit deeper into this. Right now you're just getting your core basics, getting your feet wet for working with a pivot table. Now if you've ever worked with filters at all in Microsoft Excel in your data, and what I mean by that, in case you're not familiar, I'm going to go back to the original spreadsheet. So just to give you an image here, from the data ribbon in a spreadsheet, you can choose the filter button, and then each column heading has a filter where you can filter individually the data within a column. Well, in a pivot table, you also have the ability to filter. That is automatic. So every time you add a field to the pivot table, you will have the filter button. So let's take a look at yours so far. This one says row labels. I'm going to first change this so it's more meaningful. Flights by office. Now here's the filter arrow. I click the down arrow and see you get all the same options that you do when you have the filter turned on for your full spreadsheet. So I have the option to sort A to Z, Z to A. I have options for filtering, quite a number of options for filtering for things that ends with, does not contain, greater than equal, so that you can then suppress the things that you don't need to see, and you can run a quick filter. And then the more sort option opens up another dialog box of choices. So you do have filter capability with your pivot tables. So let's get a little deeper with your pivot tables. One of the things like for this pivot table, it's very small. You know, in the real world, we're working with quite often very large pivot tables. And when we are, it becomes even more important about the layout of your pivot table. And one of the options we have is from the design ribbon. So let's cover some core basics there before we get into some deeper aspects of the pivot in general. And from the ribbon at the top, there's Analyze, as stated before, and then there's Design. Well, with the Design ribbon, besides the aesthetics, the styles that are available, which these are live preview styles, meaning when you hover, you'll see how that style is going to look in your pivot table. In addition, over to the far left of this design ribbon, you have a layout group. The layout group has a button for report layout. And when you look at those buttons and you look at the graphic really closely, you can tell by the graphic the kind of arrangement your data is going to be in when you select one of these. For example, looking at my screen, look at it closely, I've got the destinations, and then within the destinations I have the offices. Well, if I choose report layout and I go with show in outline form, you see the difference? instead of the destinations being right over the office, then now the offices have moved out to the right, and I can see very well the names of the destinations. So the layout you choose is dependent upon what works best for you, but it's also to be aware of where these options are. So report layout again, and then there is the option to show in compact form, which is what I had a moment ago. So compact form is just giving me a slight indentation of the second and any succeeding fields that I might have added. Now, other things, little things about working with the pivot table. We want to get these little things out of the way. The bigger the spreadsheet is, the more fields that you have. When we look at the pivot table pane on the right, it is laid out so that you see a list of your fields first, and beneath you have those 4 quadrants that I've already explained. But if you look very closely to the right, there is an option. Let's see if I can get my toolbar to move out of the way. Yeah, I don't think I can. To the far right, which my toolbar is overshadowing, there is a button for you to choose how this list is laid out. You can fix it so that you can make a choice that the field list appears on the right in one long list, and then these 4 boxes will stack upon one another. So it's all a matter of what your preference is, what works best for you when you're working with that pane on the right-hand side. And something else that just a little something that inevitably, if you're brand new, this is probably going to happen to you. It's easy to have happen. If you ever turn off the pane on the right, it's called your field list, and it does have its own closure X. And in order to get that back on from the Analyze ribbon, or in your lower versions of Excel, the Options ribbon, the very last group of tools is a Show group, and there's a button for the field list. So if you've ever closed the field list, it would take that button to bring that pane back, for you. So just little things that can cause you grief as you work within your pivot table. Other things to consider, and we are going to get deeper into this in just a moment, but there's so many little things for you to keep in mind. For example, one of the things you're going to learn today is how to create a chart off of a pivot table. Well, when I'm creating a chart off of a pivot, maybe I'm trying to compare the first quarter against the second quarter between my offices to see how they did in sales on this campaign between one quarter and the next. Well, in that case, certain things I want suppressed in the data before I create the chart. For example, I might not want to see grand totals in my data. I want it turned off. And you can turn these various things off, such as totals, from the Design ribbon. So on the Design ribbon, once again, in the Layout group, you see there is a button for subtotals. Now, subtotals has the choice of do not show subtotals, show all subtotals at the bottom of a group or the top of a group. Now, mine, for example, if you're looking at mine, Boston, the subtotal for Boston is at the top. Now, I have a friend who works with Excel a lot in her business, and she hates the fact that it defaults to subtotals at the top. So she was so pleased the day of training when she found out that she can put those subtotals at the bottom. That's her preference, as it is for many of us. When you click the subtotals button, I will choose Show All Subtotals at the bottom of the group. And now if you look back at my screen, Boston at the top doesn't have the subtotal on the right. Here's Boston total, and there's the subtotal. Now, getting to the grand totals topic, when you don't want grand totals, you can turn them off for rows and columns, on for rows and columns, or just on for rows, etc. Just want you to know where all these features are that you can turn on and off when needed. In addition, on the Design ribbon, when you look at my screen, see, I've already chosen a style, but there are other additions here to your styles. Right now, row headers is turned on. I'll deselect it so you can see that without the row headers, you can see that I don't have that colorized definition on each of those primary headings. I'll choose row headers again, and now see Boston is blue, Cancun blue. It's giving me visual definition. Then there's an option for banded rows. Now in this case, and it's dictated by my style, I'm getting horizontal lines in my pivot, where if I choose banded rows, in this particular one, I'm getting vertical lines. But I want you to know this, depending upon how many columns you have and the style you've chosen, your banded rows may not be vertical lines. They may result in solid background colors, and then in every other column would have a solid background color. So just be aware of what your options are, because it's about how you can read your data the best. So let's go back to analyze where all the goodies are for working with a pivot table now that you've gotten these core basics down. Let's start adding some things in. And I'm going to go back and create one from scratch, and this will give you an opportunity to see it from the beginning as I build onto the layers. So here I am back in the master. Once again, I want to create a pivot table. Starts with the insert ribbon as stated before. In the tables group, pivot table. As we explained this box earlier, I'm just ready to go with all the defaults. Click on OK, and I once again have another sheet, because you can have more than one pivot table sheet in your workbook. So keep that in mind. All right, so here's one from scratch again, and I'm going to start building. This time, I want to see where they sold flights to. That's the destination. It is a text field, and when I click, there are all the flights. And I want to change the column heading so that it makes more sense. In addition, I want to know how many tickets were sold to these different destinations. It is a numeric field, and when I click, I will get a sum of the tickets. In addition, I want to know when these tickets were sold, but I want the date. I want the date to appear as a column. Well, since that's the case, it will require clicking, dragging, dropping. And clicking on date, I'll drag down to the columns box on the right, and now look at my screen. Here are all the dates from the master spreadsheet. But wouldn't it be nice if you could see those dates in different arrangements where the data has a lot more meaning? For example, I've just done tickets. Well, how many tickets did I sell in the month of January and February in this campaign? How many tickets did I sell by destination within the quarter or within the year? You can group dates of information in a pivot table, but here's what's key to you doing the grouping. What's key is you must click in a cell that contains a date or time, whichever one you're working with. In our case, it's dates, because if you don't select a field with a date, your group field option located on the Analyze ribbon in the tools called Group field will be dimmed out if you're not in a cell of date type. So I am in a cell of date type, and I do want to group these in something that's more meaningful for analyzing. So here I am on the Analyze ribbon, coming down to the Group set of tools, choosing Group field. When you do, the dialog box appears and gives you the full date range of your entire spreadsheet. And of course, you can change your starting and ending dates. But here are all your options for grouping. It always defaults to months. So in this particular case, at this moment, I do want to see it in months. That's just one click away. So after clicking on OK, here I am, January, February, March, April, May, June, etc., along with a grand total of each. So now I'm looking at how many tickets by month. And as I look at my report, I want to know how many tickets were sold to Duluth as the destination in the month of January, and I can see we sold 10. and then over to the far right for a grand total of 39. Now, what if you wanted layering? You want to have quarters along with months, and then have that capability of being able to temporarily suppress the months and just focus on quarters, toggle back and forth between the two. And that's very easy. Once again, I'm going to have to be in a cell of date type. So any one of these months is fine to click in. Just making certain that I always have group field as a choice. I'm still on the Analyze ribbon in the group set of tools, group field. It's still set to months. And I want to keep months, but I want to add quarters, and then we'll be able to toggle back and forth between the two. I'll go ahead and choose quarters and click on OK. Now take a close look at my screen. Quarter 1's there, quarter 2 is there, and then of course my months are there. But because there are two different groupings, the quarter 1, quarter 2 has a collapse icon. There's a dash next to quarter 1 and quarter 2. So if I click on the dash for quarter 1, click on the dash for quarter 2, or the minus symbol, now I have collapsed all reference to months, and I am looking solely at quarter values. But then when I want to come back to the monthlies, I've made it as easy as a click to go back and forth, and I'll click the plus sign for quarter 1, plus sign for quarter 2, and now I'm seeing my months. Now on this next one, if I just wanted to see the year only, that's all I want to see, then it would be, again, click on a date cell, back to group field. In this case, I don't want to see anything but years. I'll start by selecting years first so that I can follow by deselecting quarters and deselecting months. And after clicking on OK, there is only one year in this data set, and that's 2010. And that is 2010. Now in this case, if I were going to create a chart, for example, a pie chart, which is perfect for when you have one set of data, I certainly would want to remove my grand totals out of the mix so that I could have a pie chart of these. Now let's look for a moment about the filters, especially if I were going to create maybe a pie chart. On the flights, if you were trying to focus on only specific ones that you wanted to analyze, well, that's where the filter comes in handy. Here's flights, here's your filter button, and I'm going to deselect all by clicking the square, select all. And at this moment, I'm interested in focusing on Cancun, London, New York, Toronto, and Washington, D.C. Now I'll click on OK. So now with the filter in place, I can just see these. And then, of course, if I turned off these totals, I could also create charts from what I see. And then, of course, the filter button, with the button that was once a down arrow, is now a filter button. So I'll click that button and choose Clear Filter from Destination, and then everything is back. So that's how easy it is for you to group your information. And I have people tell me all the time who come to class, because primarily I'm in the field training to corporations, and I have people tell me almost every class, oh, where were you last week? And I had no idea that this worked the way it did, and I could have saved hours with what I was doing and what I will be doing. So if you haven't used this before and you have big spreadsheets and you have to constantly run reports, then you should be on cloud 9 after this. And now let's go over another critical point. You need to understand that if you went back to your primary spreadsheet that you created the pivot off of, if you make any changes within this spreadsheet, that information is not automatically updated in your pivot report. What you would need to do is this, and I'm back in the pivot. If you make changes to the master sheet, then you will have to tell Excel to refresh that data, and that is done from the Analyze ribbon. So here on the Analyze ribbon, in the data group, there are only two icons in the data group. There's Refresh and there's Change Data Source. We're going to cover both. Refresh would always need to be clicked in order for Excel to go out and update your information. And now keep this in mind. When I say make changes to your spreadsheet, I mean to anything that was already in the spreadsheet when you created it. But later on, you might have decided that you needed to add a couple of more columns, and those columns weren't in the middle of your insertion, but they were on the outer side of your data. They were to the right. For example, in promotions sales, the last column is commission, but if I were to add 2 more columns here, I'm outside that range. It would pick it up if I inserted, somewhere in the middle. But if that's the case, you've inserted more on the outer side. Make certain that you, from the Analyze ribbon, in the data group, choose the button that says Change Data Source. Changing data source will take you to the spreadsheet that you created your pivot table from. Excel will show you what the current range is, the one that was chosen in the beginning, and then you'll make your necessary modifications to the range so that it will include any additional columns and rows that you added at the time that occurred after the time that you created your pivot table. So those are 2 very important buttons: refresh for updating, change data source for changing the range that you are creating the pivot report from. All right, so now let's move further. So that's 2 important buttons. We've gone over your built-in styles, which, let me get back into your pivot. Just remember, when you're not in the pivot, as stated before, you'll lose your ribbon. And we've been over the design ribbon, but we haven't gone over how to create a chart from your data. I want you to keep this in mind. Charting is a very detailed aspect of a tool and of using Microsoft Excel. So if you have never created charts in Microsoft Excel, you still would be able to do something basic even without a prior knowledge. But when we create this chart, you're going to see that there will be multiple ribbons once we're in a chart with many different options. So charting alone can take a couple of hours to teach. But if you have a good background in charting, then you'll find this helpful when you want to go to a greater level with it. So let's work on getting a chart created from the pivot table. The first thing is you need your data arranged the way you want. So here's what I want. I want to see a list of my offices again, and I want to see how much money they've been making, but I want it broken down by quarter, and then I want a column chart that will show me the comparison between those 2 quarters. So a few clicks to change things around. For example, on the right-hand side, I do have date, which I do want. I'm not interested in seeing the destination anymore, so I'm going to deselect destination, and I'm going to select office. I'm not interested in seeing the number of tickets, but I am interested in seeing the amount of money, so I'll choose total. So now I'm looking, and I need to change my title up here. Once before, flights was correct, but they're not now. This is by office. In addition, I'm wanting it to be broken down by quarter, and I'm on a year layout. I'll click on the 2010 so that I will have the group option when I go to the Analyze ribbon, and then to Group Field. And I'm interested in quarters now and no years, nothing but quarters. So now I've got quarter 1, quarter 2, but I don't want grand totals either way, vertical or horizontal, to be part of my chart. So I need to go to another ribbon, Design, and here's the option, grand totals. I want them off for rows and columns, and now I have just what I want. The offices and the quarterly breakdown is what I have. And after we do the chart, I will be covering the filters part of your panel here on the right in just a moment. All right, so now I'm going to create a chart, and the chart option is on the Analyze ribbon. From the Analyze ribbon, on the far right, you have a Tools group, and you have an option for a pivot chart. So when you click Pivot Chart, you'll be presented with the charting engine of Excel, where you can choose from column, line, pie, etc. But just keep in mind, if you're new to charting, that not all chart types are the best ones to use for your data. For example, this is 2 columns of information, and the type of chart is the best ones suited to this are column and bar are 2 very good types that are best for doing columns of data like this. I'm going with a column. It's showing me it's going to be a clustered column, but you have other options as well on the right. I'm going to go with the default and click on OK. Now what will happen is the chart will appear inside your pivot table report. It can be moved, and we will in just a moment, but let's take a look at how this is all going to work. When the chart appears, it is movable, it is resizable, and to move it, when your mouse pointer is inside, you have a 4-headed arrow, and it's just a matter of clicking and dragging to move it as one unit. To resize it, then you would be using the corner points where there are squares. In the side points left and right, there's a circle, and that is the case in the mid top and mid bottom. In any of these points with circles or squares, they're actually probably all circles from the way it looks. When you approach, you get a double-headed arrow, which would be for resizing. So I'm resizing from the bottom here and from the right-hand side of the screen, of the chart rather. So those are very simple. You've probably done those things before, but there's some unique aspects of working with a chart from a pivot rather than working with a chart from standard data in your spreadsheet. One of the things that I like is that with a chart created from a pivot, it provides you with built-in filters. So as I look at this, I'm looking at all the offices, a comparison by quarter. But if on the fly I wanted to look at a handful of offices, maybe there are 4 that I have in mind, and I can then change this chart on the fly with the filter that is right here in the chart. Down at the bottom, because I'm working with offices, I get an office filter. I'm working with dates, I get a date filter. I'm going to go with the offices, which right now everything is shown, and I'll deselect all, and I want to see a comparison between Brooklyn Center, Rochester, St. Paul, and 2 harbors. And now look at my chart. So on the fly, I can look at my data in different directions on my chart. I'll go ahead and click my filter button that's now in place as a result of filtering the office, and choose the option Clear Filter from Office. Now take a look up at the top of the screen. I'd mentioned earlier that when you create a chart from the pivot, you'll have a Pivot Chart Tools tab, and there are 3 ribbons of tools associated with you working with a chart. There's Analyze, Design, and there is Format. And so should you ever take one of our charting classes, you would learn about all of these ribbons, or a good number of them at least, a good number within the webinar. But now, if you're more seasoned and you work with charts, then those are where your options are. But let's cover how you would get this chart in a different sheet if you don't want it to be housed in with the pivot table. This option to move it to another sheet is on the Design ribbon of your Pivot Chart Tools. Now I'm on the Design ribbon, and then to the right, the very last button is Move the Chart. So when you choose Move Chart, your options are to have it as an object in another sheet, and of course you could rename the sheet, and then there's one that says New Sheet Chart 1. And there are differences between making it a chart sheet and placing it as an object in just a spreadsheet. And the big difference really is just the fact that if you put it in a sheet of chart type, you won't have grid lines on the screen. you will not have column letters, and you will not have row numbers. So it removes all that, what I call busyness, that I don't really need to see, and places it in a sheet without those things. So I'm going to go with New Sheet, Chart 1, which you can rename it on the fly right here. And that will name the tab. I'll click on OK. I'm still in the same workbook, but now it has its own sheet of chart type. And there are no grid lines, no column letters, no row numbers. And down below is my tab that says Quarterly Sales by Office. So I have it in its own sheet. Now, a couple of buttons you have on the right of your chart. You have one that says Add, Remove Chart Elements. And if I click that button, this is a quick way for you, especially if you in the audience haven't worked with charts before and you don't know where these options are on the 3 ribbons that come with the chart. This is great for you. And even if you are more versed, it's still great because you have this quick access to adding titles to your chart, an axis title, a chart title, adding grid lines or a legend or a trend line. So these are quick ways for you to do that. That's what the plus button is for. Then the second button is a style button. So it gives you quick access to changing the style of your chart. These are pre-built styles that come with specific labels with them. So I'll scroll through and you can see there's quite a number of these. Some I wouldn't want. These are quick ways for you to place common elements on a chart that we need, like titles, for example. Now let's go back to the final thing that you haven't been taught. And of course, there are lots of things to learn about pivot tables, but what you've learned and what you're going to finish up with, you should have a really solid core foundation for taking any spreadsheet that you have, assuming that it's structured the way that I described at the beginning. You should be able to create a pivot table with no problem. We certainly hope that's the case. So let me go back to the pivot table. This one was where we had quarters. And the one area I haven't covered with you in this pane on the right, the pivot table fields pane. There are 4 boxes, and the one I haven't covered is the filters box. So we make a few changes first. I'm going to go ahead and add my destination back in so I have my offices and broken down by destination. Now, if you'll remember, in the primary spreadsheet, there's a column for commission. And it simply states whether or not that particular cell carried a commission or it didn't. It didn't state what the numbers were. But when you're creating your pivot table, you may have certain fields that you don't want the data itself to be in the pivot table, but you'd like to use the data from there to filter and see what the impact is of filtering using that field. For example, here I'm looking at Blaine, and Blaine office is at $1,887 for Q1, and I see all my numbers. Now, this is inclusive of everything that was commissioned and not commissioned, but I don't want to add the field commission into my pivot table and see the words yes, no, but I would like to see how these numbers fall out based upon commissioned and non-commissioned. And I'm going to place the field as a filter so it works outside of the pivot. On the right-hand side in the field list, I'm going to drag commission down to filters, let go, and if you look back on the top left of my screen, that field appears outside of your pivot. And it's set to everything, all, so it's got the yeses and the nos. When you click the down arrow for that filter, you see all the options that are coming from the field, but there are no squares to the left of it to select. They don't come into play until you come to the lower left where it says select multiple items, and when you click, then all boxes will now have check marks. So now I am interested in seeing what the numbers would look like if I took no out of the equation, looking at only cells where there was a commission. And when I click on OK, my numbers have changed. I don't know if you noticed or not, but Bloomington's Q2 was a higher number. It's now at 1072. So I'm looking at how the numbers would look. In fact, I'm going to quickly, we have a little time for this, I'm going to see how this looks on an annual basis. I'm going to change the quarters. So I'm on Q1. I'm going back to the Analyze ribbon to Group Field, and I want to look at it by years this time, years only. So here are my year numbers, and I'm going back to the Filter button, and I'm going to choose All again. And so here's the All. There's Blaine 2351, Bloomington 5168. I'm going to add the grand totals back from Design. Grand totals, on for rows and columns, so I can get a better picture. Now let's look at the filter again. I've got it set back to all. Right now, grand total for Blaine is 2351. I'll go back to my filter button, deselect the no. I am set to just looking at any records where there was a commission, and you can see my numbers change. So the point is, I may not want the data to be part of the physical table, but I do want to be able to look at data that's impacted by the filter. And that places us at a wrap. We are at top of the hour, and I hope that you feel like you've got a good solid foundation to start with pivot tables. And I am ready to take questions.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you.
I hope those of you who are joining us today picked up as many new little tips if this is something you're more familiar with than not. And for those of you who are joining us that this is a brand new concept, I'm sure you're probably thinking, wow, how in the world did I not know all of this? Because that was the feeling I had the first time we went through this. This is a fantastic tool and a major efficiency component in helping you be more comfortable with using Excel on a day-to-day basis and some of the reports and things that you're asked to pull together. I know I had a situation with a client this week that they basically have all this data that they copy-paste every single time they need it from a bunch of documents into this report. And my first thought was you should have this in Excel so that you can just generate these reports very quickly with pivot tables. So hopefully this gave you some ideas for things that you can potentially convert into this format if you don't already have them here, or ideas for how to take what you already have and be more efficient at manipulating it for the needs of your business and team. All right, if you have questions, you can type them into the question box. We don't have any in there at the moment, but I know this is a lot of information, and Donna does a very good and thorough job of explaining it bit by bit. So if you think of things after today's webinar, you're welcome to connect with us through any of the social media channels, or our contact information is provided on our websites. You can email us directly and ask your questions that way when you start using it, because sometimes it's after you get into it a little bit that you realize, oh, I wonder exactly how we do that particular step or that particular, make that particular tool work the way I want it to. Well, Donna, you must have been about as thorough as you could possibly be, because we do not have any questions at the moment. So,
well, maybe it was a refresher for some, and of course you can always welcome to send us questions, and we always also like to know other things that are pain points for you in Microsoft Excel, because Julie and I can put together almost anything. So it's a matter of us knowing where your needs are greatest, and then we'll work with you from there.
Absolutely. We do have one quick question here, and the question is, let me see here, I need to get back to this particular screen. Is the webinar available to be sent out? Her computer froze up. Yes, we will send the replay out typically, for sure, within 24 hours, sometimes a little bit sooner. You'll get a replay email from GoToWebinar directly, as well as one from our system, and those will also include links to some practice sessions, or I'm sorry, practice documents where you can actually test some of this out on your own computer with something that isn't a valuable or important document that you're currently using, and that way it gives you a little bit of a chance to trial run that. So a couple of thank yous added in here. So with that, Our goal today, obviously, was to give you as much as we possibly could in an hour to arm you with the tools and strategies that you need to take back to your computer to implement it, but it does require that you're committed to that process. So take the sample files that we send with the replay, give it a test, practice, maybe over the next couple of days, give it a test run, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to connect with us with any of our contact information that's provided here or through our website directly and with email. So with that, I want to thank each of you for investing your time and energy and joining us for today's presentation. That concludes today's webinar. Thanks again for participating, and we look forward to seeing you in class again very soon. Have a productive afternoon, everyone.